Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. In the interest of time, I'm just going to get started. We appreciate you participating in today's virtual discussion. My name is Tara King, and I am a Senior Project Director at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS for short. AAAS is the world's largest general science association and the publisher of the science family of journals. I serve as the Center Coordinator for the SSTEM Resource and Evaluation Center, which is abbreviated as the SSTEM REC. The SSTEM REC is happy to organize this virtual event facilitated by our REC partner colleagues at MN Associates, Inc., which features the work of Dr. Zahra Hazari on assessing disciplinary STEM identity through surveys. Next slide, please. First, we'd like to know who's joining us today and see what are you curious about regarding our topic today. In the chat, we invite you to introduce yourself by sharing your name, institution, and STEM project track, if you have an STEM award, and tell us what one or two questions do you have about the evidence-based practice of assessing STEM identity. I'll move forward, but please continue to introduce yourself and post your questions and curiosities in the chat. Thank you for doing this, as your questions will help guide our discussion today. Next slide. Let me quickly go over a few housekeeping items to help us better facilitate today's session. Please keep your microphone on mute while not speaking. When we get to the Q&A portion, and if you wish to speak to ask your question, you may use the raise your hand button to do so, and we will call on you. However, throughout the webinar, we encourage you to write your questions or comments in the chat field. If you're comfortable doing so, we welcome you to turn on your camera. To help us get to know one another and learn what your interests are on this topic, please continue to introduce yourself in the chat and write what questions you have about STEM identity if you haven't yet done so. We're happy to have two American Sign Language interpreters joining us today. In addition, we're pleased to have a live transcriptioner providing closed captioning. Our thanks to these individuals for helping us make the information presented in the webinar more widely accessible. The slides being presented today can be found on the AAAS STEM REC website. If you'd like to follow along with the slides on your computer right now, you can do so. Let me put that link in the chat. And I've also posted a link to the event webpage. When the recording of today's session becomes available, it will be posted on that website. You'll also receive a follow-up email with these links so that you can have the slides and the recording handy. We hope that the event runs smoothly for you, but please, if you have any technical difficulties or questions, contact my colleague, Jamila Blake, in the chat or send her an email at jblake@AAAS.org. Finally, we would really appreciate your feedback on today's session. Toward the end of the webinar, we'll provide a link to a short participant survey. This survey will also pop up when you exit out of Zoom, and we thank you so much in advance for taking a minute to complete it. Next slide. One final logistical piece. It's important for me to share a few disclaimers with you before we dive in. This material is based upon work supported by the National Science Foundation under grant number 222-4093. Any opinions, findings, interpretations, inclusions, or recommendations expressed in this material are those of its authors and do not represent the views of the AAAS Board of Directors, the Council of AAAS, AAAS's membership, or the National Science Foundation. Additionally, the AAAS STEM REC is promoting consultation with MNA as they are a REC partner. but this does not constitute an endorsement of M&A as evaluators by the National Science Foundation. Next slide. Now let me give you a quick snapshot of the AAAS STEM Rec. In October 2022, through a competitive proposal process, AAAS received NSF funding to manage the STEM Resource and Evaluation Center, or REC for short. The REC's work focuses on promoting the exchange of ideas, resources, opportunities, and knowledge about effective strategies and practices to increase the number of talented, low-income students who obtain degrees and careers in STEM. The activities of the REC work across multiple levels to increase the effectiveness of the entire STEM portfolio, build the capacity of campus STEM programs, as well as the professional development of STEM scholars. We welcome you to visit our website to learn more about the REC and to join our mailing list to stay informed. And I will put these links in the chat for you. Next slide. While the REC is managed by AAAS in coordination with NSF, we could not reach our goals without the significant contributions of our full team. This slide shows all of the organizations we partner with to carry out the work of the REC. I want to highlight MN Associates, who provides research and evaluation technical assistance support to current and prospective awardees, and who is facilitating our webinar today. And with that, I'm happy to turn things over to Nina de las Alas of MNA. Nina?
Hi, thank you, Tara. So these are the objectives for the webinar, and just want to quickly offer this as an opportunity to dive deeper into the sense of identity, one of the evidence-based practices we've been covering through when we rolled out the repository of the EBPs. Next slide, please. And this is today's agenda. Zahra has her own breakdown of her presentation, but we're just going to make sure that you understand that we're going to leave the Q&A at the end, but we welcome all your questions and we're following them through the chat. So please feel free as we go through the presentation that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them when we get to the Q&A section. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, that this is part of the various resources that we have, like the EBP repository, but also included in that is we have a guidebook that's now professionally printed and ready to go, and it's also available online. So please take a look at these resources. I want to also take this moment to open up an invitation that these resources, particularly the EBP repository, is a living document. So we would welcome any feedback, any recommendations to include and review some resources, some citations, some articles. So please let us know. And then for the guidebook, it's a really good piece of work that M&A has helped put together. And so please take a moment to take a look at that. Next slide, please. And so I'll take this moment to quickly introduce Dr. Zahra Hazari. Zahra is the professor at Florida International University, and she's been a PI or co-PI in several NSF grants, including a large multi-institutional STEM grant. And her research has earned her a National Science Foundation Career Award, and her research findings have been featured in well-known publications such as the U.S. News and World Report, Washington Monthly, Science Magazine, Nature, Scientific American, Life Science, Science for the People, and APS News. So with that, I'd like to open it for Dr. Zahra Hazari. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Nina. Can everybody hear me? Are we good? All right, sounds great. Thank you. I thank you for those who are giving me a thumbs up. I love it. So again, my name is Zahra and I'm at Florida International University, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about like the history and the development of these STEM identity measures and how they might be useful, particularly to STEM grants and STEM programs. So if you want to forward it for me, Jamila, I'm going to give you a thumbs up for forwarding, so I don't always have to say forward. Okay, so just a quick overview. I was going to talk about the history of some of these measures and where they came from, their reliability and validity, because as scientists, as STEM folks, we want to make sure that the things that we're measuring are actually predicting people's choices and behaviors in real life and their experiences in real life. And we're not just measuring things for the sake of measuring things. So we want to have some predictive ability with these measures. And then how you might utilize the measures, some suggestions, and then where the research on these measures is going, and the new sort of directions that maybe even an STEM grant can push forward in a new way. Okay. So with that, the history of the measures. So just a quick timeline. Early on, you know, prior to the 2000s, there was work on similar constructs, on related constructs like self-efficacy, like Bandura's sort of classic work, competency beliefs within schooling, which came from the education literature. And then self-concept was another area of study. And I can go into the details of how these conceptions were different from the construct of identity as we currently conceptualize it, but I think that will take too long and probably not be pragmatic for you. So I'll leave it at that and jump forward to then there was a huge host of qualitative research on science identity in the 90s and in the 2000s, early 2000s. Which was basically showing that a lot of students were, when they started to see themselves as science people, they were more likely to engage effort, they were more likely to perform better, they were more likely to persist to the next class, et cetera, but qualitatively. And so then there was a need for the quantitative work that came in, and there were early measures of science identity that were developed. For example, Jill Martin's Is Science Me work, as also Ashbacker's Is Science Me survey. There were other role identity of science student surveys, et cetera. And one of them were the measures that we constructed as part of our exploration of disciplinary science identity or disciplinary STEM identity. So then this took off. We developed these measures for disciplinary STEM identity, and they got adopted into other disciplines, including math, including computer science, including chemistry. So those references are some of the references from other areas. They also got expanded to other roles. So not just as a student, but sometimes as a researcher or as a professional or as, you know, like some other role or as a scientist looking at STEM identities with similar types of measures. And then finally, like going forward, there's lots of advancement of the theory and the measurement around STEM identity. Okay, we can move on, Jamila. Thank you so much. All right, so first, I was asked by AAAS and by MN Associates to talk about the one single item STEM identity measure that they have in the repository. So the theoretical basis for that item, what came from like education, primarily from G's work on like identity as a certain kind of person. And also Berkson-Stetz from sociology had the same kind of construction of like identity within certain affinity spaces as being a certain kind of person and being recognized as a certain kind of person and recognizing oneself as a certain kind of person. Okay, keep going. So, and this also was emerging from the qualitative data. So like when students were getting interviewed in the qualitative studies, they were saying things like, I'm just not a math person, or I'm just not a science person. So the language of the item was constructed from those interviews, from the ways in which students were saying they saw themselves as science people or not science people. And then becoming more specific to a discipline. So they would say things like, I'm just not a physics person, because my space is in physics in particular. Okay, keep going. So the one item measure is some variant on this. There's some variations of this one item, but in general, it's an item stem like I see myself as a science person from not at all to 5 very much so, like a Likert type scale with 2 anchor points and labels on those anchors. And the science, I underline it because that got replaced by physics, it got replaced by chemistry, it got replaced by math. So it got replaced by STEM in general. And it was still functioning pretty well in terms of predictive ability of students' choices and some of their behaviors. So hence this one item became a bit useful to people. Okay, keep going. So it was applied to various disciplines. Okay, next slide. And then beyond the single identity measure, though, because we know psychometrically speaking that one measure is measuring a latent construct with one item is deeply problematic. So there was a lot of theoretical development of the theory around identity. So this initial model came from Carlone and Johnson and from their qualitative work of scientists. And so then it was adapted and items were developed for each of these constructs: recognition, interest, performance, competence, beliefs. Then a single item proxy was built from those underlying constructs. So that was the multifactorial type of measure for STEM identity or disciplinary identity, depending on what you were studying. And most of the work that looks at the single item measure versus the multi-dimensional, the multifactorial measure, they yield similar results. So if the single item measure is predictive of something, usually the proxy is also predictive, but the proxy gives you more variability than the single item measure. So that's why often for research purposes, it was better to use the multifactorial measure than the single item measure, but both were functioning and yielding similar results. Okay, keep going, next slide. So now to the reliability and validity of the measure. We want to make sure that whatever we're using is reliable, valid for the populations we're working with, so that we're making the right interpretations and of the results that we see. So Jamila, can you forward it? For the single item measures, again, I might blow through this because it may not be of that much interest in terms of practicality, but just to give you some evidence around the reliability and validity. So for criterion-related validity, one of the things that's really important is that if STEM identity as a theory or disciplinary identity, whether it's biology identity, chemistry identity, math identity, physics identity, computer science identity, engineering identity, whatever it might be, whatever discipline you're talking about, it should be predictive, theoretically speaking, of the choices that people make and behaviors that they exhibit if it's a useful latent variable. So if how a person sees themselves with respect to a discipline is important, then it's going to be predictive of their choices related to that discipline. And so when we do criterion-related validity, we want to make sure our measures are predictive of those outcomes in order to make sure we're actually measuring what we've constructed theoretically as being mapping to the theory of like identity. Okay, so keep going, Jamila. So for the criterion-related validity, research has found that the single item measure predicts disciplinary achievement, predicts the intention to pursue a career in the discipline, predicts the likelihood to pursue an undergraduate program. So if you're in undergrad, it's the likelihood of you choosing to major in that subject area. And then if you're majoring in that subject area, it predicts whether you want to go to grad school or not, right? So we found that even the single item measure has a huge amount of predictive ability for many persistence type measures, as well as like achievement type measures. Go on. Yeah. In addition, the construct validity is strong, meaning that when you compare the single item measure to the multifactorial measure, they always have strong correlation. So greater than 0.7 sort of correlation between the two measures, usually much higher than that too. So there's usually like convergent validity between similarly measured or similar measurements. And next one. And there's also test-retest reliability. So if you give the item to a group of people and then a group of students, you give it to them again without anything happening in the middle, their responses are pretty stable, right? So it's pretty reliable, the one item measure over like a brief period of time where nothing is happening in the middle. So it's a stable measure. Okay, keep going. For the multi-factor measure, again, similar things have been studied. Keep going, Jamila, let's go through this a little faster. The criterion-related validity, again, it predicts the intention to pursue a discipline. And then keep going, Jamila, let's populate all of this and then I'll talk through it. The construct validity is usually studied with factor analysis. So on the right-hand side, you can see one example of a factor analysis on a math identity item where the items that are aligned to interests are strongly loaded on the interests subconstruct. And same for recognition and for competence and performance. The loadings on all of these across multiple papers are greater than 0.6. And the model fit indices are really good for the models across multiple papers, multiple different disciplines. Internal consistency, like Cronbach's alpha, is also high, greater than 0.7 across multiple studies. And test-retest reliability is also high, greater than 0.7 across multiple studies when you do it, even with multiple items, when you're measuring the proxy when you're trying to create a proxy for STEM identity or disciplinary identity. Okay, next one. Okay, so now this is probably the more important part. How do you utilize these measures, or what are they particularly useful for in an STEM context? And so I think there's two major branches of how they might be useful, or how I think they might be useful. So let's do the first branch first, Jamila. The first branch is understanding the discipline in relation to identities. And so what I mean there is that we want to know what it means to have a computer science identity, for example, right? So if you have this measure, you can correlate it with other things to try to understand what is the nature of what it means to be a computer science person, or the nature of this discipline that's being conveyed to students. Keep going, Jamila. Let's populate that side. So that includes what constitutes the knowledge that is valued, what types of performances or beings, types of doings, beings are valued, ontologies are valued, what kinds of values are optimized within the discipline. Do they value making money? Do they value getting, a high-paying career? Do they value helping society, right? Like, what are the values that are tied to these disciplinary identities that then tells you something about the discipline itself? And then who constructs these identities? So are there certain people who are constructing these identities? How do they vary in terms of like demographics, et cetera? So it can tell you something about the landscape of what a discipline is and how it's been constructed. Okay, next, can we do the next? Just do all of them, Jamila. And then the next sort of thing that it's useful for is examining the impact on educational practices. So if we know that identity is important for predicting all of these important things for our students, then we can use it as a measure to see whether the practices we're implementing are impacting those identities for students. So you can look at like how current practices within programs are impacting students' disciplinary identities. You can also look at new interventions that you might put into place through an STEM initiative, how they impact how students see themselves. I mean, this is pretty like straightforward and common sense, but I'll give you a couple of examples of how we did it in a minute in one of our STEM projects. All right, I'm good. Jamila, we can move forward. Okay, so this is just a general layout of the way in which I think about these two branches that we can use STEM identity to study. So if we think of a discipline, the expectations, the practices that are valued, what the boundaries of that discipline are, then we can study what are the things that shape those boundaries. So can you, Jamila, just keep going, keep animating for me here. So we can study the practices that constitute a discipline and the values and the knowledge that constitutes a discipline. And then we can also study when a student, for example, interacts with the discipline and those practices and that knowledge, she might think, keep going, I'm not a STEM person, right? So then it tells us something about the way in which the construction is interacting with human beings, right? And the way different human beings are reacting to that construction of that discipline. And then the other thing we might do, keep going, Jamila, is we might then implement some strategies that change that box somehow, expand that box, permeate that box in a different way, that then she might think, maybe I am a STEM person, or maybe I am a computer science person, or a chemistry person, or a physics person, et cetera. Okay, so this is the way in which we utilize it. I do want to give a caveat here. our goal is never to fit the student into the box of the discipline. So to take her and to somehow fit her into what has been prescribed in the discipline, but rather to implement interventions within the disciplinary spaces that then expand that meaning of what it means to construct that identity, what it means to participate in that discipline, that then she may want to belong there, or another student may want to belong there as well. Okay, keep going. This is one example of the first branch, the understanding the disciplines. This was one of the studies where we used the one item measure, and we looked, the 3 columns is, we asked college students, and this was a general population of college students, not just STEM majors, early in college, in the first couple of years of college, whether they saw themselves as a biology person, a chemistry person, or a physics person. And then we just looked at how this varied based on demographic groups. So like those who identified themselves as female, those who identified themselves as male, and then within those groups, those who identified themselves as white non-Hispanic, Black non-Hispanic, and Hispanic. And as a physics person, I right away see the problem in physics, right? You see, looking across all these groups, the red, this is the, if you look at the last column, the red is below the blue. Across all the groups, right? For white non-Hispanic, Black non-Hispanic, and Hispanic. And so you could see, like, regardless of what racial ethnic group the students are identifying with, you see that the women are lower on seeing themselves as physics people, right? And so, like, this is the understanding the landscape that you could kind of use these measures for. Okay, now the other side of understanding practices, which might be a little bit more useful for STEM programs. Can you forward it, Jamila? Sorry, I'm not giving my thumbs up. So this was a study we did. It was part of an STEM grant where we asked the students, and this was a multi-institutional grant of undergraduate computer science students. And we asked the students, and this was all students, not just students in the STEM program, about their kinds of experiences they had while in the undergrad program. And then we regressed those experiences on the computer science identity construct to see what were the experiences that were correlated positively or negatively to computer science identity. And there were some interesting results, but it gave us like a little bit of an inkling of what we might need to work on in terms of practices. So you notice the 2 negative ones, right? The being mentored by others and the students in class help on classwork. So we right away identified that there was a problem when students are helping each other, where some students are feeling marginalized or feeling like they might be lesser in some way, may feel less recognized, might feel there might be some tension in those interactions and relationships. And so we may need some kind of training for students, especially if they're stepping in as like senior students, mentoring junior students, which was part of our program. That they might need some training and how to be supportive of those students and recognizing their capabilities and not making them feel lesser. Because it was the mentoring students that felt really recognized and felt like they were computer science people, not the mentees. So it gave us like an avenue to really try to think about how can we do something different that will help in this particular program. And there was other things that were positive that we could amplify and accelerate and do more of. And then holistically looking at the whole program, next slide, Jamila, another study we did, this is again, the same STEM grant. What we did is we wanted to know, this is on the evaluation side, we wanted to know if the things that we had embedded, we created a community of practice for the STEM scholars, right? And we gave them lots of different kinds of like support mechanisms, but we wanted to know, does it have an impact on them compared to students who didn't get it? So we did a multivariate matching analysis where we matched the students who were in the program, in the STEM program, to students who were not in the program on demographics, on their GPAs, on their computer science GPAs in particular, and other sort of factors, their year, so whether they were seniors or juniors, et cetera. And then we looked at how do the 2 groups compare in terms of their computer science identity, in particular, their recognition, their performance competence beliefs, their sense of belonging, and their interest. And we found significant effects for 3 of the 4 factors that sort of like were underlying the theory that we were using for computer science identity. So this gave us some evidence that the things that were being put in place by the STEM grant and initiative that we were putting forward were actually impacting the students who were getting them in some meaningful way that went beyond, or especially in comparison to other students who were very similar after matching. Okay. Let's go on. I'm almost out of time. So as we go forward, these measures are constantly being expanded, are being iterated, are being changed, modified depending on context. So going forward, this is where it's going. Jamila, we can keep going. Yes, and give thumbs up. Just populate it and I will fill it in. So some of the directions this is going is that there is contextual variation. So for example, you notice sense of belonging was added in, right? We noticed that sense of belonging became predictive of our disciplinary identity construct for senior students, not so much for freshmen, because freshmen weren't in the disciplinary community yet. They hadn't formed like a disciplinary community, but by senior year, their identity is really fed by their sense of belonging to that community. And so there's contextual variation in how you should be measuring these things, depending on like, who are you talking to? Like for scientists, interest is not really that important because they're all interested. So their sense of belong or their identity isn't shaped based on their interest because they're all interested in science. Now it's shaped more by their feelings of competence compared to their scientific peers, right? So I think there's contextual variation here. There's additional factors that turn on, turn off, depending on the context. And there's new roles that are being studied. So for example, McDonald came out with a 1-item measure for professional STEM identity, which is different from the measure that we had used in the past, but I think is useful. And researcher identity is another one that's now sort of an expansion area. Teacher identity, whether people see themselves as teachers or as educators, especially with respect to STEM. So those are all sort of growth areas. And I think I'm at the end, if I'm not mistaken. Yep.
Thank you so much, Zahra, for zooming through right through those items. And as you can see here on the single item professional STEM identity, here's a kind of a visual of that McDonald et al. Research that Zahra pointed out.
Yeah, that's the one question measure that they used. It was a visual measure where the student has to select, or the professional has to select one of those boxes to represent them.
Yeah. So at this time, do we have any questions? Or if anyone wants to delve in deeper into some of the particular slides that you see. So, you know, we did go through a few that were rather quickly. Are there areas that you want to delve into deeper?
I've thoroughly bored them to death.
I don't think so. I don't think so. Well, let me turn this over to Zahra. Zahra, is there particular area you want to kind of, since we have a few more moments here, that you kind of quickly went through that may be of interest to our audience? I think I saw some folks when they were coming in that they were looking at, you know, various measures, and they're saying that some of these have been used, you know, for upper high school. If there's anything, you know, any others that you could recommend. So, yeah.
I think there's a lot of different modifications that happen, and I would say you take the items and you modify them for your particular population. Like, I'm never an advocate of just taking something and using it without thinking about the context in which you're using it. I saw in the chat somebody asked about longitudinal measures. So we did do one longitudinal study on math identity where we gave the math identity survey questions, and then we gave it to the same students 3 years later. And what we found was the single identity measure was very stable. But if you wanted to see small fluctuations and changes, then you needed to be more sensitive in the data collection. So you needed to collect more detailed measures like on interest, recognition, competency beliefs. So I think it also depends on what the purpose is for the measure. I would say if you want to detect small changes based on small things that you're implementing in your program, you probably want a more sensitive measure. You want something that will show more variability than a single item measure, even though it's like really comfortable to have a single item measure. But like if for evaluation purposes or for purposes that, I don't know, I feel like if it's summative, if it's a kind of like a summative thing that you're doing, then maybe the one item measure is good. But if you're trying to like look at like small things you're implementing the effect of them, then the more variability you have in the data, the more likely you are to see something. I don't know if that's helpful. I'm just randomly like spouting off words.
No, it's fine. No. Are there any other questions? Anybody have any like to post? Here's one from Patricia. I'm wondering if you made any changes to your program to improve belonging among your students. I think it's interesting that belonging is impactful for seniors, but not as much for freshmen.
Yeah, so in that particular study, Patricia, it wasn't a study that was tied to the STEM grant. That was a study that was tied to a different, actually, I don't even know if that was a funding source or something we just did on the side. Oh, that was tied to, a completely different grant where we weren't doing any interventions, but we noticed that when we did structural equation modeling on the freshmen versus the seniors, that what became important, what sense of belonging turned on for the seniors, and it hadn't turned on as something that affected their identity for the freshmen. And so like it made us realize that we can't just measure these things and assume they're important at this stage for this context, right? Like the same example I was giving about scientists, right? For scientists, you can't differentiate them in terms of identities if you look at interest, because interest is going to be high. You're going to hit a ceiling effect for all of them, right? What you need to do is measure something else that's more differentiable for them, like feelings of competency as a scientist or something else. Feelings of recognition also might be more important for practicing scientists in terms of their identities at that stage. So I think it depends. We didn't do an intervention to increase sense of belonging in that particular study, but in another study actually that I haven't listed in the references, we did look at counter spaces, which is like we had like a conference that was focused on for particular groups, and that had an impact on the sense of belonging. It went up through that experience.
Great, thanks. We have a question from April Kilgore. We find that our engineering students have a good STEM identity, but our pre-professionals typically do not identify as STEM. Have you seen that with any of your studies? So you've pointed out one. Is there any others?
Yeah, I think that that is a great point, that the pre-professionals might have different conceptions of what it means to do STEM. And I think that in and of itself is a very interesting research question for the first branch I was talking about, to understand disciplines and like how do people construct the box of STEM and what counts and what doesn't count, right? So I personally haven't studied pre-professionals because my area is in physics primarily and looking at disciplinary identity in physics, although I've moonlighted in other disciplines, as you can probably tell. But I haven't studied pre-professionals in particular, but I think that's like a really interesting direction, because I completely agree with you that I do think that that hypothesis would show in the data. And there may be stuff that Remy has done, I don't know, Amy, around the pre-professionals and how they may see themselves less as STEM people than people in like engineering, biology, chemistry, you know, like the more traditional boundaries of STEM.
We have a question from Amy Owen. Amy asked, are there specific subgroups that some of these measures have been validated with? Or more specifically, do we know that they are validated for use with college students of color?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have done measurement and variance testing. So what we did is when you have a set of items that you're giving to a group of students, you want to make sure that that set of items functions the same way for like students of color as well as for other students, right? In order to use those measures reasonably, right? So we have done measurement and variance testing, and we always get strong measurement and variance for all of the measurement and variance testing we've done. And I can direct you to the particular articles. But again, they usually are in a particular context of a particular disciplinary study on identity, right? So it's not like generalizable to everything. You can try to like then apply those same things to another discipline and redo the measurement and variance testing. But they have, every time I've done it, and I've done it for computer science, I've done it for physics, and I've done it for science identity more broadly, or STEM identity more broadly. And we see measurement and variance, meaning that the way the items load onto the factors, the way in which that they are constructed is similar for students of color as non-students of color. So then we feel more confident that we can use them validly for looking at like questions related to different student groups. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a great question.
So yes, Adam, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, I really appreciate the opportunity to ask a question. Great information and presentation. Going back to constructing what the expectations and practices are of disciplines before you make these comparisons and interventions. I'm wondering what that looks like, because my curiosity leads me to believe that there are sort of global practices and expectations for disciplines. And then also maybe there are like regional and more sort of community-based practices within disciplines. And I'm wondering what that looks like to construct those, the expectations and practices of a discipline. What does that look like?
That's a great question and super complicated, but I will give you I'll give you my sort of approach to it. So like in physics, right? Like there is like a huge compendium of literature going back to the 80s of students' perceptions of physics being heteronymous, being difficult, being masculine, you know, like there's like, and they've done it with implicit association tests, right? Not just like interviewing students, where students have these implicit associations with physics as a discipline. And so like, those are some of like, I think the broader trends, but again, the data comes from like the US, right? So that's the way in which it's constructed in the US. So I'm not going to generalize globally, but at least in the US context, that might be like sort of certain perceptions of physics as a discipline. But then there's other aspects we haven't studied. So you can study them through interviews, asking students, what does it mean to be a good physics student, right? Like what are your thoughts about like, what does a physicist do, right? And they'll give you a whole lot of information, and often it will be completely off. But this is the ideas they're constructing about the discipline, especially as they're going through classes. They come up with these notions of what it means, and we don't even realize we're transmitting these notions of what it means. So I think I have heavily leveraged qualitative research, and my colleagues' research that they've done, that's excellent, that tells me what are students thinking. And my population is obviously students. So I think about what are students thinking as they're constructing the ideas of what is this discipline? What are the expectations? What are the boundaries? What do we do? What is the acceptable knowledge? Yeah, it always strikes me that like students think that physics is about right answers. Like it'll give you the right or wrong answer. And you're like, oh, that's not what physics is about.
Thank you so much. So it's clear it's more about the expectations of the students than the people in the discipline that are veterans, right?
Right, but somehow that's being transmitted, you know, like that through cultural.
We're getting it from somewhere.
They're getting it from somewhere, and yeah, it could be also from the broader society as well, like media, etc. But what we found is their classroom experiences don't shake those perceptions, right? So even if they're getting it from somewhere beyond the scientific community, it doesn't shake their perceptions once they're in a classroom either. So we have to kind of think creatively about how do we like expand the notions of what it means to participate in the discipline. And I think there's been so much good work around growth mindset and how do we shift students towards thinking of science from a growth mindset perspective rather than a right and wrong perspective.
Thank you, Adam. Anyone else would like to broach a question out loud? Please raise your hand. Okay, Tara?
Thank you, Zahra. So I have a question kind of related to what we were just last talking about. And I totally don't expect you to have an answer, but just wondering your thoughts. As I totally applaud efforts to make STEM learning environments more student-centered. You know, there are some programs that are doing great in this area. But then I'm wondering, these students then go on to, say, a graduate school context or a job talk or a disciplinary society conference. They're in these other contexts outside of their very welcoming, student-centered undergraduate program. And then they're facing with this, I thought I fit in, but now maybe I don't.
Yeah.
I know it's a much larger project outside of the, you know, a much larger problem outside of the classroom, but any thoughts on like, you know, if we're talking about disciplinary areas and practices, that's such a large, as we talked about, and not even, you know, international kind of sphere. How do we approach not only making things more welcoming in the classroom, but also affect the larger disciplinary cultures?
So again, I think culture is not something that a single project can do, right? Like it takes an entire society to change cultural narratives, right? But we have, like, you think of perturbation theory, right? If you have enough perturbations, you might move to a new steady state, right? But if you have one perturbation, it's going to do nothing. So I think what I think of is that if collectively more projects are doing this kind of work and thinking about this kind of work, of expanding the boundaries of disciplines, rethinking the culture of the disciplines. And I'm very culturally oriented in my work. It's not going to like water down the discipline. It's going to make the discipline stronger, right? So I'm always thinking about it in those ways. But in the meantime, as those students come through our system, they have to face the system, right? Like, so our physics students, for example, they might have a wonderful classroom experience that we create for them. But then when they go on to graduate school, they go to a graduate school where they are slammed and it's all performative and it's all judgmental on, you know, certain types of performances that they're not used to, right? And the way in which we've dealt with it in our projects, Tara, is we make them aware of what's coming, right? Like, so it's not about lying to them and saying that this is a new culture of physics and how it's going to be. It's making them aware of the system around them, because once you're aware of the system around you and how it's acting on you, then you don't internalize it, right? You can resist against it, right? So then you're not saying, oh, I'm not as smart as this kid next to me, that's why I'm not a physics person. You're like, no, there's something going on here that's making me feel like I'm not capable. Do you see what I mean? They are able to recognize how the system might be acting on them and then resist it, like not internalize it. So that's basically what we try to do, is equip them when we have them, to equip them with that understanding that like the system is always acting on you, right? And so it may not be you. And there are circumstances where it might be them, right? Like they need to like modify they need to study in a different way, for example, right? But often it's not them, and they have to be able to be reflective of how the system is acting on them, and then externalize it, not internalize it.
Thank you, Tara.
I know, putting the onus on the victim, I know, but what do we do, right?
Thanks for that wonderful question. Adam, you get to win the award for posting the last question.
Well, I don't want to take up any more time since I've already asked a question, so I just want to make sure no one else has any questions before I ask my second question.
You're good.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I did want to follow up on exactly what Tara was asking because I'm wondering what your thoughts are, Zahra, about mentor training. Because I think, like you just said, putting the onus on the students for culture change is just an enormous responsibility, not just for the student, but for the programs that are supporting the students. I think we are thinking about incorporating mentor training as a component of our student support effort in our STEM proposal. What are your thoughts? What have you seen in relation to that works well?
So, so our mentor training had to do with like, first of all, getting the right mentors, right? Because not everybody is going to be the right mentor. Like if you get a senior undergrad for mentoring a junior undergrad, or even a grad student mentoring, that not all of them are going to be the kinds of support. So it's like selecting the mentors appropriately. And because you're paying them, it's like a benefit to them, right? But then also focusing them in the training on what they're doing, right? Like, and making them cognizant of these results, that like, you're not there to make this person feel like they have deficits. You are there to help support them and help them realize their potential, right? It's a very different framing, right? And so I think in the mentor training, if like you're helping them realize that their job as mentors is not tutoring students, right? Is not getting them through this assignment, is about helping them realize their capability to do it, right? Like coaches, then they are going to reframe how they're interacting, because they may be interacting in that way, not even knowing the effect that it would have on these junior students. You know, so I think it made us cognizant of like, oh, this is a problem here that we need to address, and our mentors need to be better prepared in what they're doing with these kids. And some of the mentors just we needed different mentors, because in computer science there were some students who just they're so individualistic that they don't know how to be communal. They don't know how to be there for others in a way that lifts the other person up, right? So some of them you could get them to that point where they, through training, they realize how to do that and they can step into it. I mean, I think the LA program is really good for that too, helping train students to be able to support other younger students learning in the right ways where it's growth mindset oriented. But yeah, I think partially it's selecting the right students, and partially it's getting them to understand what their role actually is.
Great question. Thank you so much. So we'll turn now back to wrapping up. Jamila, bring up the next slide. If you still have questions you want to pose and want to follow up with Zahra, you know, you can find her, and I think we may have links to contact her. Also, we have this evaluation technical assistance request form. So if you want to follow up, this is another way to do so. So please set up your phone, take that QR code, or follow that link, which you'll see also in the slide. And next, Jamila, right. We have a short participant survey, as Tara asked, and this is a way for us to understand if we're making an impact through these types of webinar series or any other topics that you may be interested in. So we want to really ask you to please take a moment to complete the survey. You can do it right now. And here's also the link. You'll also be reminded as you step out of this webinar session. But we really appreciate you taking this moment to complete the survey. And with that, I'm going to transfer it back to Tara.
Thank you, Nina, and thanks, Zahra, for your insights, and thank you all for participating today. We want to make you aware of 2 other upcoming sessions that might be of interest for you to join, and welcome you to join us. We have on May 1st at 2 p.m. This is another evidence-based practice virtual discussion on the College Student Mentoring Scale Survey with Dr. Crisp from Oregon State University. And then also on the topic of mentoring, on April 28th, we have, as part of our capacity building at MSI series, a webinar exploring effective mentoring practices that will feature a panel discussion with 2 sets of mentor-student pairs. So that will also be a great conversation. And I've put the registration links to each of those in the chat. And last slide, please. Thank you all for participating. We really appreciate your questions and insights. With special thank you to Dr. Zahra Hazari for sharing her research and her knowledge and wisdom with us. Thank you again for the audience for joining, and we'd love for you to stay connected with the rec. I posted on the website links to our website. You can join our mailing list, connect with us on LinkedIn, follow us on social media. And we look forward to engaging with you in future rec webinars and activities. When you close out, you'll receive that survey. Please take a moment to take it and provide your feedback. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.